This lecture will focus on roughly the years 1763 to 1775, discussing why the American colonists eventually ended up revolting against Great Britain. In this lecture, we have the following objectives. First, we will discuss the ideas and the thinkers of the Enlightenment, especially those thinkers that had a direct impact on the American Revolution and the ideas of the American Revolution. Second, we will identify and explain the significance of the ideology of Republicanism and virtue, as well as their impact on the rhetoric of the American Revolution. Then we will explain Britain's main reasons for attempting to overturn salutary neglect. We'll talk about what that is and why they did it. Then we'll explain how the colonists responded to the new acts and trace the evolutionary process that brought the colonies closer to rebellion. Then we will trace the path to revolution from the Townshend Acts of 1767 to the meeting of the First Continental Congress. And finally, we will explain how the American Revolution began, describe the first battles in the conflict, how it ended, and the Treaty of Paris. The Enlightenment was a movement to prioritize the human capacity for reason as the highest form of human attainment. So reason is front and center in the Enlightenment. And in order to understand this shift, you have to kind of understand what most people in the early 1600s believed in the Western world. The first thing that most people in the Western world believed was in the unquestioned primacy of rulers. And the unquestioned primacy of rulers, both spiritual and secular. So the Pope was not questioned. What the Pope said was what it was. The king was not questioned. What the king said was what it was. The second thing that they believed was in humans' incapacity for social change. They believed in humans' incapacity for social change. This is how humans are. We cannot change, and we probably shouldn't change. This is how God obviously wants it. So if you were born a serf, you stay a serf, and trying to become anything other than a serf was not okay. This is also a very pessimistic time. They tended to view humans and society as degrading, getting worse. And a lot of this had to do with the fact that in the Middle Ages, for example, they're comparing themselves to the glories of the Roman Empire, or at least what they think the glories of the Roman Empire were, because they could see the roads that still existed from Rome. They could see the structures that Romans built, such as the aqueducts. They remembered the Roman legions, at least in lore. And compared to that, most of what medieval Europe was rather small. So it was this idea of getting smaller, getting worse. And finally, they believed that our time here on earth was a temporary interlude on our journey toward either eternal salvation or damnation. So the focus of our intention shouldn't be on the here and now, but instead to what was coming after. So most of these people would be very, very religious, Catholic for most of history. They would probably attend Mass at least once a day, sometimes several times a day. And their world is steeped in a religion and supernatural kind of lens. So if a cow fell over dead in a field, you or I would look at that and go, wow, I bet the cow was sick. He must have had a bacteria or a virus. And just as we take that as truth, if that happened in the medieval world, an equally valid explanation is a witch cursed the cow when it died. I wonder where the witch is. And with the same belief that we have in viruses and bacteria, they would have that belief in there's a supernatural explanation for this. Now, it's not going to be until the 1500s that European scientists begin to question these ideas. And slowly throughout the 1600s, educated people will begin to change the way they see. So this shift in thinking happens at different rates, at different times, in different places. It starts with the elites and it eventually trickles down. So it begins with the educated people in the 1600s, that people began to believe that natural laws, not divine laws, govern society and the universe. So they're taking the supernatural out of this and attributing it to natural laws that are governing the way society works and governing the way the universe and nature works. And furthermore, that these natural laws were accessible to humans through the use of reason. This is very different from what religion says. Religion outright claims that there are things that are unknowable, things that are mysteries, things that cannot be explained, cannot be understood. This is saying no. Everything follows certain rules. It's not some random deity, you're at the mercy of some random deity's whims, that everything is very organized, very structured, and very understandable. So this is one of the major shifts and what the Enlightenment is trying to do. So we'll pause here if you need to stop and catch up on anything. Then let's start talking about some of the tenets of the Enlightenment. And first, keep in mind that there are far more than just what's listed here. The Enlightenment is a huge movement. It takes place over hundreds of years and involves hundreds of people. It takes place on several different continents. So there's a lot more than this. And furthermore, this isn't a list that every single Enlightenment thinker would have agreed with, but it is useful as a kind of general overview. So the first general tenet is that members of the Enlightenment believed that the universe was fundamentally rational. So this is that rationalism. The universe was fundamentally rational and could be understood through reason alone. So this is rationalism versus mysticism. The universe is fundamentally rational and could be understood through reason alone. In other words, there's not some mystical explanation for events that are kind of unknowable. Why is it raining? I don't know. God must be angry. That wouldn't have been acceptable. It would have been there's a natural law that causes things to rain, and we can understand this if we think about it. So, rationalism versus mysticism. The second idea was that truth can be arrived at by empirical observation and through the use of reason and systematic doubt. Truth can be arrived at by empirical observation and through the use of reason and systematic doubt. So first, this idea that truth is knowable. In religion, oftentimes there's this idea that truth isn't knowable, at least not in this life. But here they're saying no, whatever the truth is, we can get at it. And we can get at it through empiricism. So if something is empirical, what it means is it's observable, it's measurable, right? This isn't some kind of mystical feeling. It is something that you can see. It is something you can measure, something that you can touch, something very kind of tangible. And so by using what we would call today the scientific method, we can arrive at truth by observing, by reasoning, and by doubting, and by asking questions. Maybe the church's take on why it rains isn't correct. Maybe something else is going on there. You have to be willing to ask that question, which is what the Enlightenment does. The next idea was that natural laws govern the universe, and these laws can be understood by humans. Natural laws govern the universe, and these laws can be understood by humans. Again, this idea that nature, that the universe follows rules. An example of this is gravity. If you drop a pen, it falls every single time. So that is a natural law. That is the way the world and the universe operates. There is this force called gravity. It's not some random angry deity who sometimes makes the pen fall and sometimes lets it float away. There is a natural law, the way things function, and we can understand it. It is knowable. Next is the idea that history is largely about human progress. History is largely about human progress. Thus, humans can better society and change. Thus, humans can better society and change. So this is a far more optimistic view about humans than what existed before. Whereas before, it's this idea that humanity is degrading, is getting worse. The Enlightenment says, no, humans are getting better and better and better. And if that's true, if humans are continuously improving, that means that things don't have to stay the way they are. In the Middle Ages, it's this idea of staying in your place, that this was just your godly ordained place. If you were born a serf, you should stay a serf, you should die a serf. This is the way the world is. We can't do anything about it. We can't make it better. This is just how it is. But this argues the opposite, that humans can change, that society can get better, that history shows us that we are. So attached to that is the next idea, and that is that humans can be improved through education and the development of reason. Humans can be improved through education and the development of reason. Again, something very different from what was the prevailing belief before, that humans were in their place because God put them in whatever place they were, and that to try to rise above your station, for example, or fall below your station, was almost a religious affront, almost an affront to God. This is saying no, that, humans, if we educate them, can become better than what they currently are. And that's a big shift, and something we take as axiomatic in contemporary America, but something that is actually a relatively new phenomenon. And finally, most Enlightenment thinkers would argue that religious doctrine has no place in understanding the natural world. Religious doctrine has no place in understanding the natural world. In other words, keep your religion out of science and keep science out of religion. Now, this certainly isn't true for all Enlightenment thinkers. There are plenty of them who are, struggling with this, and many who are endeavoring to understand the scientific world to better understand God. So this certainly isn't a blanket idea. And I certainly don't want to give the impression that most Enlightenment thinkers are atheists. Very, very few are atheists. Most are very, very religious, especially by today's standards. But it is making the case that whatever is laid out in the Bible, for example, perhaps is not the best way for understanding natural phenomenon. And this kind of separation between science and religion begins here, though different Enlightenment thinkers take this to different levels. So we will stop here if you need to pause to catch up on something. The next idea about the Enlightenment that is very, very relevant for the American Revolution is this concept of the social contract. And this is something that Rousseau talked a lot about. So our Enlightenment thinkers spend an awful lot of time talking about humans in a state of nature. And what they mean by a state of nature is this idea that if there was no government, if there was no laws, if there was no rules, if there was no structured society, what are people like? And it's this argument that the first humans existed in a state of nature. So Adam and Eve, naked, frolicking on a hill, are in a state of nature. And they continued on that it was here that humans had natural rights. Natural rights are rights that people have solely because they are human. It is based upon their humanity. It does not come from a king, it does not come from a pope, it comes from their humanity, these natural rights. So what these natural rights are of course debatable, even to this day. An example of this is healthcare. Is healthcare a human right, right, is another way of saying this. Or is it not? And in the United States, this tends to split people. If you got cancer and you cannot afford to pay for cancer treatment and it's a curable cancer, is it okay if you die from this cancer that's curable because you can't afford the cure? And some people say yes, it's not the government's job to provide health care, and others say no, that health care should be a human right, like food, like shelter, whatever. So these remain debatable. But for purposes of this lecture, the bare minimum that most Enlightenment thinkers would probably agree with was that natural rights included life, liberty, and property. So the bare minimum here, and for purposes of this lecture, natural rights include life, liberty, and property. So this discussion over what are humans like in a state of nature is ultimately getting at what is the ultimate nature of mankind. Are we naturally kind? Are we naturally evil? Are we generous? Are we selfish? Are we hateful? Are we loving? What are humans really like if you take away all the trappings of society? Now, some Enlightenment thinkers, in particular Thomas Hobbes, argued that all human motivation was based on selfishness, that humans at our core are selfish creatures. The only reason why we do anything is because we expect or want to get something out of it, that there's no such thing as altruism. And so, Hobbes argued that life in a state of nature would be short, nasty, and brutish. So it follows then that if humans are all selfish, then we are certainly not safe from each other. Because in a state of nature, you have absolute freedom, which means you have the freedom to steal, you have the freedom to murder, you have the freedom to harm people. You're free, you can do it. And so I would have, in a state of nature, I would have the right to murder you and steal your bottle of water because I was thirsty. The problem with this is that it also means that you would have the right to murder me and take my water, which is a lot less fun. So, in order to protect ourselves from each other, we form societies and live within a social contract. In order to protect ourselves from each other, we form societies and live within a social contract. So the very fact that you live in a society means that you implicitly agree to the social contract. It's not anything you have to sign. Because you live with other people, you have agreed. And so the social contract means that we give up some of our rights in order for other rights to be protected. We give up some of our rights in order to have other rights protected. So I will give up my right to murder you and steal your water, but in return you give up your right to murder me and steal my water. And so this is how society and social contract works. But there's a problem. We certainly can't trust humans to always do what they say they will do. So we are going to need some authority to enforce the social contract and to protect natural rights. And so this, according to Enlightenment thinkers, is the purpose of government. The reason why governments exist is to protect natural rights and to enforce the social contract. That is the whole purpose of government, to protect natural rights and enforce the social contract. And attached to this idea is the concept of the consent of the governed. And that is this idea that the only reason why the government has the power to enforce the social contract is because we, the people, give it the power to enforce the social contract. We agree to cede this authority to the government in order to do these things. We consent to be ruled by whoever is ruling us. So we will pause here in case you need to stop and catch up on anything. Now we will look at some specific Enlightenment thinkers, particularly those that had the biggest impact on the thinking of the American Revolution and in America's founding documents. The first Enlightenment thinker we'll look at is John Locke, who lived from 1632 to 1704. And he wrote that government has no other end but the preservation of property. So for Locke, oftentimes he tends to equate property with freedom and freedom with property. To Locke, a lot of the time, they're kind of two ends of the same coin. But Locke argued that one's environment was more significant than divine decree in the development of character. And so he believed that the human mind was blank at birth. That is the tabula rasa, the blank slate. The human mind was blank at birth. And thus, humans only learn through empiricism. So this has very, very radical implications if you tease it all out, especially for somebody living under a monarchy. Because what Locke is basically saying is that no one is initially better or worse than anybody else. And so really it's an attack on hereditary privilege, which is something that was very real in his world. There's a reason why the king's son gets to be king. And it's because that while they don't understand how genetics works, they do kind of have this idea prior to the 1600s of, royal blood somehow being special. And you see this even in lore and fairy tales where, the princess, by virtue of being a princess, has magical powers, right? She can make flowers bloom or talk to animals or something. It all has to do with this concept of royal blood. But, and who made them royal? Well, God, obviously, right? So it's divinely, inspired. Locke turns that on its head and he says, no. At birth, we're all empty. So we make ourselves who we are. And so really this is the kind of ideas of meritocracy creeping its way into society, this idea that you should be able to rise on your own merit or fall on your own merit. So Locke's main work is called Two Treatises on Government, which he wrote in 1690. And among other things, in Two Treatises on Government, Locke argued that government should be based upon natural law. And furthermore, that absolute power is unnatural. And government should be based on natural law, and that absolute power is unnatural. He continues on that the purpose of authority is to protect human equality, freedom, and private property. The purpose of authority, in most cases government, is to protect human equality, freedom, and private property. And that to secure those ends, we enter into a social contract with each other. So here you can see those ideas of Rousseau coming in. Keep in mind that a lot of these Enlightenment thinkers read each other. They interacted with each other's ideas. So it's a very interesting and exciting time intellectually. So to secure these ends, we enter into a social contract. But Locke takes this a step further, because Locke then asks the question, what happens if it's the government that breaks the social contract? The government's job is to enforce the social contract, to protect natural rights. So what if the government is the one that's violating the social contract? What if it's the government that's depriving people of their natural rights? Well, in response to that, Locke says that if the government breaks the social contract, then the people have a right to revolution. And this is why the language in the Declaration of Independence is the language in the Declaration of Independence. When you read that document, it is a justification to the world as to why this revolution is legitimate. The colonists desperately want legitimacy. They don't want this to look like some rabble-rouser mob just kind of causing trouble. They wanted to be recognized amongst the major nations of the world as something that was legitimately based on grievances. And so when you read the Declaration, it's a laundry list of charges against the king, all with the aim of proving that the king has violated the colonists' natural rights, that the king had broken the social contract. And so Locke, the Declaration of Independence is basically a Lockean justification for revolution. We will pause here in case you need to catch up on anything. The next Enlightenment thinker is Montesquieu, who lived from 1689 to 1755. He wrote that, "But constant experience shows us that every man invested with power is apt to abuse it and to carry his authority as far as it will go." I always think of the shift leader at McDonald's kind of being the quintessential tyrant. Give somebody just a tiny bit of power and they suddenly become God and abuse it. In any event, Montesquieu's main work is called Spirit of the Laws, which he publishes in 1748. And it's in Spirit of the Laws that Montesquieu called for a separation of powers between the executive, judicial, and legislative branches of government. And he has in his mind the British constitutional system following the Glorious Revolution, but it certainly applies later on. The whole idea behind the separation of powers, of course, is to prevent tyranny. If tyranny is when one person gains absolute power and uses it to oppress others to deprive them of their natural rights, the idea here was to divide up power, and that way nobody could have it all. Nobody could become tyrannical. And so he advocated for a system of checks and balances, this idea that each branch would be able to prevent the other branches from going too far. And so Montesquieu is the most influential thinker on the composition of the American government. Montesquieu's ideas are why there's an Article 1, Article 2, Article 3 of the United States Constitution, which is dividing up power. We will pause here in case you need to catch up on something. A few other Enlightenment thinkers that are important to the American Revolution. The first is Voltaire, who lived from 1694 to 1778. And Voltaire advocated for freedom of speech and freedom of religion. So if you have those two things, if you have freedom of speech and you have freedom of religion, it also seems to indicate that you have freedom of thought too. And that's pretty significant. This is also a lot of where the ideas in the First Amendment come from. And Voltaire's famous quote that kind of sums up his writing is, "I may not like what you have to say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it." Another Enlightenment thinker is Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Rousseau is the one that talked about this idea of individuals having natural rights to life, liberty, and property. And these natural rights to life, liberty, and property were things that not even the king or the pope should be able to take away. And that in order to secure these rights, we enter into a social contract. And then finally, Adam Smith. Adam Smith wrote a book called The Wealth of Nations. And it's in Wealth of Nations that Smith argued that there was a natural balance in the economy determined by the laws of supply and demand. There was a natural balance in the economy determined by the laws of supply and demand. And that's natural balance is achieved by something called the invisible hand. So by the invisible hand, what he means is that the market fixes itself. The market will automatically adjust supply and demand to appropriate levels. That the government or outside entities don't need to get involved. There's an invisible hand that does it automatically. So Adam Smith is kind of the godfather of capitalism. He doesn't invent capitalism. Capitalism invented itself. But he is the Enlightenment thinker who most thoroughly sat down and kind of codified and wrote about capitalism as it was existing. So we will pause here, and in case you need to catch up on anything. So the Enlightenment is the intellectual and ideological background to what's about to start happening in the colonies. So, prior to 1763, the reigning policy of Great Britain towards the colonies was something called salutary neglect. What salutary neglect meant was that there were laws on the books governing how the colonies should be behaving. There's already a tax on tea, for example. There's already rules about, British soldiers and everything else. But in general, these rules were not enforced. So while there are laws on the books, as long as the colonies were doing the things that the British were particularly concerned about, things like upholding the tenets of mercantilism, for example, they were more or less leaving the colonies to their own devices. This is salutary neglect. Now, the event that is going to change this, that is going to overturn salutary neglect, is going to be the French and Indian War, which ends in 1763. The French and Indian War is actually part of a much larger European conflict called the 7 Years' War. And so it's mainly being fought on the continent. The French, but in this because these are empires, whenever the mother countries go to war, the colonies tend to get dragged into it as well. And so in North America, this is primarily going to be the French and their Indian allies versus the British colonies and their Indian allies. And following this, after bloody battles, both on the continent and in North America, the British emerge victorious. So after the British win the French and Indian War, they decided to reform the colonies, and they had 3 goals to do this. They wanted to tighten royal control, they wanted to limit settlement, and they wanted to raise revenue. And we'll talk about each one of those goals in turn. So the first goal was to tighten royal control. And the main way they wanted to do this was by eliminating absenteeism and corruption of royal officials in the colonies, and by limiting smuggling. So first they wanted to limit absenteeism. What absenteeism was that there were a lot of British posts, leadership posts, that were fairly lucrative, that were just left kind of empty. And so the way this would work is, say the Duke of whatever. The Duke's oldest son is going to inherit, so okay, he hangs out. Maybe the second son goes into the military. Okay, he's taken care of. But what happens to the Duke's 3rd or 4th or 5th son? And so oftentimes what would happen is the Duke would go to his buddy the king and say, little Johnny here needs a job. Johnny here needs an income. And the king would say, well, I have this, post of, customs commissioner in Boston. And it pays pretty well. And so Johnny gets this post. The problem is it's in Boston, which is the boonies during this time period. The colonies are kind of wretched by British standards. They're far away, they don't have the entertainments or the civilization or the luxuries that certainly most of these upper crust and aristocracy bred people would have been accustomed to. And so they didn't want to go. And so they would take the job, get paid for the job, but never actually go to the colonies and do the job. And so the British are trying to crack down on that. And so to do that, in 1760, they pass, the Privy Council issues the Orders in Council that required absentee officials to occupy their posts. And the reason why they're wanting these officials to occupy their posts has to do with that second goal, which was to eliminate smuggling. Smuggling in the colonies was big, big business. A lot of people did it. And by smuggling, we mean trading with people or trading goods with people that were not the British Empire, which oftentimes is violating mercantilism, depending on the product, or bringing in goods or exporting goods without paying the requisite taxes. And so while salutary neglect is the railing policy, this is kind of, par for the course. This is pretty much what most people did. But now the British government is going to try to crack down on that. And so that's the idea behind having these officials in, to really kind of crack down on smugglers. So we'll pause here in case you need to catch up on anything. The second goal that the British had was to limit settlement. And so the original 13 is where the original colonies are. You can see it here on the map in this dark green. But after the French and Indian War, the British are going to win territory from the French. And this territory is most of this area in light green, with the exception of Florida. Florida belongs to Spain still. So they are going to get this territory. Now, of course, this territory is not empty, right? Native Americans live here. And this territory is one of the main motivations that American colonists had to fight in the War of 1763. One of the grievances on the North American continent was that British settlers wanted this land. They have land lust. They want to expand westward. Can't go east. There's ocean. So you could really only go westward, but of course the French and the Native Americans that were allied with the French were blocking this expansion. And so this was one of the main motivations behind colonists who fought against the French with the British. So what the Proclamation of 1763 did, this is the main way they're going to limit settlement, was it did three things. First, it placed a moratorium on government sale of Western lands. Placed a moratorium on government sale of Western lands. And by west, we mean basically this area here, right, where the border is across the Appalachian Mountains and the Appalachian Mountains. Secondly, it put trade with Indians under royal control. It put trade with Indians under royal control. And finally, it forbade settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains. It forbade settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains. And that, of course, was the land that the settlers wanted. So there were three goals to them doing this. I mean, there was a purpose. The first reason why the British wanted to do this was because they wanted to push more colonists up into Canada. So Canada is up here, and it is British territory as well. And compared to the colonies, it's pretty sparsely populated. And so they wanted to kind of fill up Canada. So rather than having people go this way, they wanted to force people to go this way, was the hope. The second reason was that they wanted to avoid trouble with Native Americans. They wanted to avoid trouble with Native Americans. Remember, this territory is not empty. Native Americans live here. This is their territory. This is their land. And Britain just got done fighting a very long, bloody war, not only with Native Americans, but with most of Europe too. They're kind of tired. They don't want any trouble. So they want to kind of pause here. And then finally, they wanted to protect British manufacturing. They wanted to protect British manufacturing. The net result of this is that it's going to cause widespread resentment all throughout the colonies. To many, again, this was the reason they fought, died, and bled, was because they wanted to be able to move west into this territory. And as far as the colonists were concerned, this was empty land. So why in the world wouldn't Great Britain let them go into it? So this is going to cause widespread resentment. The third goal of following the French and Indian War was to raise revenue. And this is where the main reason they're doing this is because after the French and Indian War, after the 7 Years' War, England is broke. England really does need to try to recoup some of this money. And so this is when we start to get into, you know, what later comes to be called no taxation without representation. I guess because it's fun to say together. And so when you hear that, one of the things I thought about was, my God, how high were these taxes? Imagine how high your taxes would have to be to make you say, you know what, let's overthrow the American government and start over. I mean, it's got to be pretty high, right? But in reality, the tax rate in the colonies was ridiculously low compared to the British Empire. The highest tax rate in New England was about 22 cents per capita, whereas in Great Britain, it was actually around $5.79 per capita. So compared to the rest of the British Empire, the tax rate in the colonies is ridiculously low. And so what that tells you is that this is not about the money. This is about the principle. It's not about how much money that colonists had to pay. It was the fact that Great Britain thought that they could tell the colonists to pay. It's this question of, if every day you came to class and before your professor would teach, they demanded that you give them a quarter. So it's not that you can't afford the quarter. Most of us can. It's just, why do I have to pay you a quarter in the first place? That's this kind of idea. So the first way they're going to try to raise revenue is through something called the Grenville Acts, which we will talk about on the next slide. But let's pause here in case you need to catch up with something. So England was broke following the French and Indian War, and Prime Minister George Grenville comes up with a plan to try to help pay off Britain's debt. And so that's what the Grenville Acts are. So the Grenville Acts are specific acts in the 1760s that increased the Crown's interference in the economy and was the end of salutary neglect. So it's a bunch of acts that we collectively call the Grenville Acts. So the first act that you should know is called the Sugar Act of 1764. What the Sugar Act actually did was to reduce the tax on sugar. There was a previous tax on sugar that already existed. It was called the Sugar Act of 1733. And so this actually reduced the tax on sugar, making it super cheap. And so you would think the colonists should have been happy about this. It is, after all, reducing a tax. But the goal behind reducing this tax was to make smuggling unprofitable. So smuggling in and of itself has its own expenses built in. You have to use alternate routes, you have to pay bribes, whatever it is. And so the goal here was to make the tax so low that it would be cheaper just to pay the tax rather than having to do the smuggling. And so many old smugglers, like John Hancock, who made their living smuggling, are going to be quite upset about this. The bigger deal was that England was actually going to begin to enforce this law. So under the policy of salutary neglect, many of these customs and taxes hadn't really been collected, or at least not collected stringently. And so now they will. And in order to enforce this, it's going to require that there be a lot more troops and a lot more officials in the colonies to enforce the law. During this time period, a lot of the functions that today we would use police for, right, or border patrol or something like that, a lot of these functions are going to be used or done by soldiers and appointed officials. And so these are going to be people not from the colonies, usually coming in from England and enforcing these unpopular measures. That's going to breed resentment naturally. Furthermore, the offenders, smugglers, are now no longer going to be put on trial within the colonies, where they're most likely going to just get a slap on the wrist and be sent home. But instead, they're going to be put on trial in admiralty courts. Admiralty courts are courts that were controlled by the British Navy. And so, in addition to actually punishing people who smuggled, this is also going to start to lead into this perception by colonists that they are second-class citizens within the British Empire, within Great Britain. Because in theory, there should be no difference between somebody born in London and somebody born in Boston. They should theoretically be treated exactly the same as Englishmen. That's how they saw each other. And they should have the same constitutional rights. And according to the British Constitution, one of the rights that people have by this point is to be put on trial by a jury of their peers. Well, these colonist peers are not the British Navy. They should have been other colonists. And so that kind of leads to this idea that they're second-class citizens, right? That they aren't being afforded all the constitutional protections that they should be entitled to. A second Grenville Act that is going to be pretty annoying is the Quartering Act of 1765. This required the colonists to feed and house British troops stationed in their territory. This Quartering Act isn't going to be the really obnoxious one that comes later after the Boston Tea Party. This typically didn't allow for British troops to be quartered in private homes. But these British troops are going to be housed and are going to be upkept at the colony's expense. So that too is going to be annoying, especially considering most of the colonists didn't want these soldiers there in the first place. So we will stop here and pause in case you need to catch up on something. So those two Grenville Acts are annoying, but the act that is really going to upset the colonists the most is going to be the Stamp Act of 1765. And on the picture you can see the first two are examples of what these stamps look like, and the last one was colonial propaganda against the Stamp Act. So the Stamp Act mandated the use of a stamped paper for all official papers. And this is going to be for everything from, a will all the way to like newspapers. So this really affects professionals the most, professionals that would be dealing with official documents. So people engaged in trade, land surveyors, that kind of stuff. But everybody is eventually going to be hit with this, including papers and pamphleteers, because eventually everybody's going to need an official document. Now, this stamp is really, really cheap. This isn't a case of people couldn't afford to buy these stamps. It's actually really, really cheap. It was designed to get a little bit of money from many, many sources so as not to negatively affect the colonial economy. If you had to pay $100 to buy groceries, you're probably not going to buy a lot of groceries, right, if you had to pay $100 in tax. But if you only had to pay a penny in tax, that's really not going to make a difference to you whether or not you buy groceries. And that's kind of what the stamp was doing. It was trying to get everybody to pay, a penny, because a million pennies is a lot of money, right? So it's designed to be very, very cheap, and not to disrupt the economy. Nevertheless, it's really, really annoying, right? It's kind of very much in your face. You'd sit there and go, God, I have to go get this stamp. Why do I have to pay for this stamp to do X or do Y? Now, the goal of the Stamp Act was to pay for British troops in the colonies. That's what the Stamp Act is for. It's meant to be used to pay for British troops in the colonies. But remember, most colonists didn't want British troops there in the first place. And so the Stamp Act is going to provoke a stronger colonial response than the Sugar or the Quartering Act. And there's a couple of reasons for that. The first reason this provokes a stronger response is because you will have an educated resistance. So this isn't going to be your kind of backwoods, unsophisticated people. The people this hits the most are the educated elites. And so you will have an educated resistance by merchants, by lawyers, who are going to be able to mobilize the masses. A second reason this mattered, or this had a stronger response, was because there was time to organize against it. There was a gap of about 8 months from the time that they let it be known that there would be this tax and the time it went into effect. And so in that gap of 8 months, people had time to organize against this. And the third reason there's a stronger response over this was because it was this idea of a external tax as opposed to an internal tax. And this is kind of getting in the weeds. Another way of saying this is a direct tax versus an indirect tax. But what this meant was that most colonists, at least at the beginning, at the time of the Grenville Acts, by the time we get towards the Revolution, they've changed their tune. But most colonists made a distinction between an external tax, which was a tax designed to regulate trade within the British Empire, versus an internal tax, something that just only affected the colony. So for most colonists at the time of the Grenville Acts, they made the case that external taxes were legitimate. This idea of, you need to regulate trade within the entire British Empire, so okay, that's legit. So yeah, you could tax sugar because it's not just sugar in the American colonies, but it also has to do with sugar in the Caribbean, and sugar in India, and sugar in Egypt, and everywhere else the British are, right? So okay, tax that. But colonists would draw the line over an internal tax. An internal tax was a tax that only affected the internal affairs of the colonies. And so what difference does it make to the British Empire if somebody pays a penny when they try to buy some land in Virginia? And the answer is it doesn't. And so this gets into the debate over the principle of the thing, right? Because for many colonists, they claimed that these internal taxes were undermining colonial self-rule and taking away their check on British officials. And so the debate for this is over the principle, not the price. Should they be allowed to do these internal taxes? Who should be doing internal taxing? Many colonists felt that only the colonies themselves should be allowed to tax themselves internally. Whereas Parliament might be okay to tax externally, many of them are going to reject this idea of Parliament being allowed to do internal taxation. And the bigger question here is sovereignty. This question of Where does power reside? Who has sovereignty over the internal affairs of the colony? Colonists claimed that they had sovereignty over their own internal affairs, whereas, of course, Parliament maintained that it was their right. And another problem with this is going to be language, because one word can have many different meanings depending on who hears it. An example of this is love. If I asked you, what does love mean? Your definition of love is probably going to be different from your neighbor's definition of love. And we see this when the colonists and the British are talking about representation. And that's that famous no taxation without representation. Because when the colonists are complaining that they're being taxed without representation, they're talking about something called geographical representation. And this is something that Americans still adhere to this day. And it's this idea that the only people that can sufficiently represent you should be from the same geographical place that you are from. So, for example, our senators in the United States Senate have to be from Texas. We couldn't have somebody who was from Massachusetts representing the state of Texas. They have to be from Texas. This is geographical representation. And so what the colonists are objecting to is that there is no colonist in Parliament. There is no member of Parliament specifically from and representing the interests of the colonies. Now for the British, this is just a weird argument, because the British came into this system believing in something called virtual representation. And so from the British point of view, they said, listen, Parliament's job is to represent the people, all the people, everywhere. And so colonists, you are part of the British population. You are part of the British people. Therefore, you are virtually represented by Parliament. It doesn't matter if there's a colonist there or not. Parliament's job is to represent the people. You are the people. You are virtually represented. And so part of this, too, is they're not understanding each other because they're using the same words, representation, but it means something very different, and they're not necessarily bridging this gap. And so, again, this comes back to sovereignty, right? Who has control here? Is it local control or imperial control? What does representation mean? Is it geographical or virtual? Keep in mind that there is no real talk of rebellion at this point. Most colonists were upset about the Grenville Acts, but they almost all wanted to change it within the system. And the Stamp Act is so unpopular that in Massachusetts, a man named James Otis decided that he wanted to create an intercolonial Congress to meet to discuss what to do. So James Otis's vision comes to fruition with something called the Stamp Act Congress in 1765. And so the Stamp Act Congress is an intercolonial Congress that met to talk, okay, what are we as colonies going to do about the Stamp Act? And keep in mind, this is illegal. You are not supposed to be meeting, trying to come up ways to thwart the will of the king and parliament. So this is not legal. This is illegal what they're doing. Now, the reason why the Stamp Act Congress is so important is because this is the beginning of where the colonies are going to start to see themselves as a possible group. And it's important to we can't really overstress that, because prior to this, the colonies see themselves as kind of independent entities. They don't identify the colonies as being the colonies. Instead, they see themselves as being New York and Virginia and Vermont and Massachusetts and Georgia, and they have nothing in common, right? They just are next to each other, but they are not united. They are not neighbors. They don't even see themselves as belonging to the same club yet. But the Stamp Act Congress is the first time where we start to see movement towards thinking of themselves as not just New York and Virginia and New Hampshire and everything else, but instead of seeing themselves as something collective, some kind of group. Now, we're a long way from becoming a country, but it's a baby step in that direction. And so in October of 1765, the Stamp Act Congress meets in New York with members from 9 colonies. And at the Stamp Act Congress, the colonists are largely conciliatory towards Great Britain. First, they acknowledged that the colonies were, quote, subordinate. So they are not trying to upset the apple cart here. So they're saying, yes, we acknowledge the colonies are subordinate to the king, are subordinate to Parliament. And the most that these radicals did was petitioned the British government to change the law. But when you are trying to get a government to change the law, there's kind of 2 steps. The first step is to aim for the heart, right? That's the first thing you should do. And that's what they're doing by saying, okay, we're just upset about this representation without, or taxation without representation. We know we're subordinate. We love you. Please change this. So they're aiming for the heart there. But unfortunately, the world being what it is, oftentimes aiming for the heart doesn't work. And so if you aim for the heart and miss, the next thing you ought to do is aim for the wallet, because that's where it really starts to get attention. And so the kind of second phase here is that we begin to see widespread colonial boycotts of British goods. And so it's here that women really play an important role, because during this time period, oftentimes it's women who will be doing the shopping. And so women will buy into this and largely be responsible for the success of the boycott. It's also around this time that we will begin to see radical organizations get formed, especially in Boston. Boston is kind of the problem child of the American Revolution. Lots of radicals in Boston, but they are everywhere, but really concentrated in Boston. And so a question to think about here is, what is a terrorist? And what does a terrorist do? And why do terrorists do it? And if we can define a terrorist as being somebody who attempts to affect political change through violence, then we have to take a hard look at some of these organizations in colonial America, such as the Sons of Liberty. So the Sons of Liberty were a secret society led by Samuel Adams. Yes, the guy who the beer is named after, Samuel Adams. And so what the Sons of Liberty did was they would threaten people who didn't support the boycott. They would attack government buildings. They would destroy government buildings. They would destroy stamps. They would attack government officials. And so there's a really fine line between freedom fighter and terrorist. And usually it depends on who you agreed with as to whether or not they are terrorists or they are patriots. Because imagine how George Washington would be described if America lost the American Revolution. How do the history books treat him versus how they treat him now? So oftentimes it's what side are you on as to how these people are described. In any event, the British are going to bow to pressure and repeal the Grenville Acts. Mostly this was because of the economic downturn that comes from some of these colonial boycotts, and it influences the king to ask for a repeal. And so the British let go of the money. But remember, this was never really about the money. This was about power, and this was about sovereignty. And Parliament knows that deep down. And so at the same time they repealed the Grenville Acts, Parliament passed the Declaratory Act of 1766. The Declaratory Act reaffirmed the sovereignty of the king and Parliament over the colonies. The Declaratory Act reaffirmed the sovereignty of the king and Parliament over the colonies. So again, this is kind of evidence that this isn't really about the money. This is about power, right? Who has sovereignty? The colonists took a different lesson, though. The colonists learned from this that if they band together, they could beat the English if they were united. And so we will pause here in case you need to catch up on something. So what is the ideology behind the American Revolution? What are the worldviews here? What is the ideology that is being followed? And so a lot of these ideas are going to stem from what were called radical Whigs. Whigs were the group that opposed the king in the English Civil War. And so it is the radical Whigs' ideas that will form the ideological underpinnings of the American Revolution. And some of the leaders included James Otis, Patrick Henry, John Adams, and Benjamin Franklin. And a lot of the time we talk about this ideology of republicanism. Now this is the ideology republicanism, not the political party republicanism, so kind of small r republicanism. And this is the idea supported by the Whigs in England and popular among the radicals in the colonies. So what Republicans believed was that power corrupts and that people will try to get more and more power whenever they can. And that eventually this power will lead to tyranny. So tyranny is the thing that Republicans are most fearful of. This idea of power corrupting and then using that power to become tyrannical, to oppress people, to take away their natural rights. This is the thing that scares Republicans the most. And so these tax issues for these radical Whigs are not about the money. It's about taking away colonial liberty. This is the thing they're worried about. That the taxes are really this loss of liberty, leading to with the ultimate aim of creating a tyranny. And so for Republicans, in addition to tyranny, the other thing that they are most concerned about is corruption. By corruption, of course, we mean the abuse of power. And so for Republicans, corruption was the death of good government. Corruption was what leads to tyranny. And that in order to fight corruption, one needed to have virtue. In order to fight corruption, one needed to have virtue. And so in this instance, virtue means very specific things. It's not the dictionary definition of virtue. The first thing virtue meant was the ability to resist the corruption of power. The first thing virtue meant was the ability to resist the corruption of power. And so you were not tyrannical. You didn't want to use your power for your own ends. You were uncomfortable with power. You didn't want power. And this was why George Washington was so revered, and is revered even to this day. And it's not that he was this fantastic general. He's actually kind of mediocre. It's that he had virtue. Because at the end of the American Revolution, he's got the army at his back. He can do anything he wants. He's the most powerful and beloved person on the continent. And there are people literally saying, why don't we make him king? And instead he says, here's the army, I'm going home. Right? That was virtue personified, that he didn't want power, that he didn't abuse his power, that he gave up power. So virtue, this ability to resist the corruption of power, and why George Washington was so beloved, and why when you read documents from the colonial period, virtue and George Washington are oftentimes in the same sentence. The second thing virtue meant was that you acted for the common good. You acted for the common good. You didn't just try to benefit yourself, you tried to benefit your society. You acted for the common good. And finally, virtue usually meant that you must be economically independent. You must be economically independent. And the reason for that is that during this time period, labor relations are very, very different from what they are now. During this time period, if you were an apprentice or if you worked for wages, whoever was over you, if you were domestic, whoever was over you, in many ways kind of this Roman ideal of, the pater familias, the head of the family, would have had a lot of power over you. You would be expected to defer to whoever your better was. So for example, today, if you wanted to get married, you wouldn't sit down with your boss at work and ask whether or not you could and get his permission whether or not you could marry your boyfriend. But in colonial times, you would have. And your boss, whether you were working for wages or whether you were an apprentice or a domestic, your boss in many cases could veto that. So labor relations were very, very different, and you were expected to give deference to whoever it was above you. And so if you were not economically independent, that means you were not independent, right? You would have to give deference to whatever this person above you was. And so you couldn't be virtuous because your decisions couldn't be based on the common good. Your decisions would have to be based on whatever the person above you said. And so being virtuous oftentimes meant being economically independent. And so history says, according to these Republicans, that republics fall from within because citizens lose their virtue. And so at the beginning of the revolution, an underlined beginning, poor people could not have virtue, right? They were not educated, they were not economically independent. And so at the beginning of the revolution, they absolutely did not want a democracy. They were scared of democracy. They considered this mob rule. The mob, by definition, is not virtuous. So this was something that, the founders would have been horrified by. What they were shooting for at the beginning, and underline that word beginning, of the revolution was this idea of benevolent rule by the elites. So the elites, of course, are the ones with virtue, and so they will lead the riffraff, unvirtuous mob in the right direction. Well, that's fine and good and all, but keep in mind that language used means different things to different people. So you can't just have the elites fighting the American Revolution. That's a pretty small army. You have to get the ordinary colonial person to buy into this, to join the army, to actually do the physical fighting of the revolution. And so to do this, the Republicans, the radical Whigs, people like Patrick Henry and John Adams and Ben Franklin begin to use revolutionary rhetoric. And it's all the kind of buzzwords we still use, right? We're fighting for freedom. We're fighting for liberty. The problem is that that one word has two different meanings or several different meanings depending on who's hearing it. So when George Washington or Sam Adams is using this word, probably not Sam Adams, but certainly Ben Franklin, right, are using these words liberty and freedom, they're thinking benevolent rule by the elites, right? But when the poor farmer or when the, the apprentice hears this word, they think it means democracy, right? That I can participate too. And so what ends up happening is that at the end of the revolution, they can't have this benevolent rule by the elites because so many people fought, died, bled for these concepts that they are interpreting to mean an expansion of political rights, an expansion of participation. And so in many ways, it was the revolutionary rhetoric that allows for greater political participation following the revolution, because the elites in many ways were trapped by their own rhetoric of promising freedom and liberty. To many, that meant the expansion of political rights. Okay, so we will pause here, and if you need to catch up on anything, please do so now. So after the Grenville Acts were repealed, England was not quite done with this yet. And what will next come of this is something called the Townshend Acts of 1767. So in 1766, Charles Townshend becomes the Chancellor of the Exchequer in Great Britain. And Chancellor of the Exchequer is kind of this weird position in the British government. It's kind of like the CFO of the government. So this is somebody who has a lot of power as far as economic policy is concerned. And so attached to one of the things that's going on with colonial reaction to the Townshend Acts is you have to remember the historical context in which this is taking place. The Grenville Acts were just done and just repealed, and people are still upset about that. And one of the first things that happens under the Townshend Acts is something called the Restraining Act. And so what happened with the Restraining Act was that in New York, they were supposed to be complying with that Quartering Act, paying for the upkeep and providing housing and support for the British soldiers in New York. But the New York Assembly was not following these rules, was not complying. And so in punishment for the New York Assembly not following the Quartering Act, they issued the Restraining Act, where the New York Assembly was suspended for failing to comply with the Quartering Act. So they basically told the New York Assembly, go home. And so for many colonists, they interpreted this to mean that self-rule was under attack. And again, we get back to that question of sovereignty. Who should have the power to govern the internal affairs of the colonies? And here with the Restraining Act, Parliament was saying pretty clearly, it's Parliament, right? Because we don't even need your New York Assembly, send it home. So for colonists, they're kind of horrified by this. They're saying this is further attacks on colonial liberty, further attacks on their sovereignty. So the Townshend Acts themselves laid duties on glass, lead for paint, tea, paper, and other items. More importantly, it demanded the collection of these duties and gave more power to royal governors. It also enabled a board of customs commissioners in America to stop corruption and enforce the laws on the books. It enabled a board of customs commissioners in America to stop corruption and enforce the laws on the books. And these laws, especially with regard to smuggling. And by and large, this worked. Smuggling in Boston, for example, which is kind of a hub for smuggling, virtually stops because of this. And this is going to upset a lot of people all down the East Coast, but especially in places like Boston, where merchants who are used to lax enforcement under the Navigation Acts are going to be furious, and smugglers who are used to lax enforcement under salutary neglect are going to be furious. So once again, the colonies are going to be upset about the Townshend Acts, and we're going to see opposition spring up again. And a lot of this opposition is going to follow the same pattern as the Stamp Act. And once again, we will begin to see a boycott of British goods. And so women, again, are going to be especially important here because it's going to be women that are doing this. And oftentimes, your politics became very, very visible. For example, one of the things that they started to boycott was imported cloth. And so women would not buy cloth and instead start weaving their own cloth. And so people started wearing homespun as opposed to kind of these manufactured cloth. So you could tell by what somebody was wearing, what their politics were. They stopped buying tea. Tea is a huge deal in colonial America. In colonial America, you either drank alcohol or you drank tea. That was kind of it, right? So if you weren't drinking alcohol, you were drinking tea. So women stopped buying tea and started brewing their own tea. And of course, that's not going to taste like tea from India, right? So you could tell as soon as you sat down to have a drink with somebody what their politics were. And by 1769, this opposition had spread to every colony, and it was popularized by newspapers. Newspapers were incredibly important to colonial life. It's not unusual for towns to have multiple newspapers, in the 10s and 20s, different newspapers in a single town. And colonists, I mean, this does sound like an external tax, right? This sounds like something colonists should have been okay for because it's taxing imports, all part of that regulation of trade. But the colonists rejected that here. They made the claim that we know this is to raise revenue. We know that you're just trying to, work around us. So colonists are now starting to object to kind of any kind of taxation. But again, it's not the money. It's who has the right to do this taxing. Okay. So once again, bowing to pressure, Parliament will repeal all the Townshend duties except for those on tea in March of 1770. So we'll pause here in case you need to catch up on something. So this leads us to something called the Boston Massacre on March 5th, 1770. And as you notice, I put massacre in quotations because it's not what it sounds like. So this is going to take place in Boston because Boston is our problem child. And within Boston, you have a lot of tension over the Townshend Acts, as well as economic pressures. Now, this actually takes place after the Townshend Acts were repealed, but unfortunately, communication being what it is, colonists didn't know about the repeal until this was already over. But within Boston, this was the headquarters of the Sons of Liberty. And the Sons of Liberty had been very busy terrorizing the government in Boston. And so because of this, to provide security for Boston and government buildings and officials in Boston, the British had brought in more and more troops. Remember, a lot of security functions are going to be fulfilled by the army in colonial America. And so for many in Boston, it felt like a permanent British military presence in the colony. If suddenly the federal government sent down the army to garrison whatever city you live in, that would get really kind of scary and really annoying really, really fast. And so now Boston has lots and lots of soldiers around who, keep in mind, have to be quartered and paid for. So that's putting economic pressure on colonists in the city. This is also very annoying. This also looks tyrannical. Why do you have these soldiers here if not to enforce your will that we disagree with? The other thing that's going on is that your average British soldier is probably from a lower economic class, and they're paid very, very poorly. So when these soldiers get to Boston, they oftentimes start looking for side jobs to supplement their income and send back home. And so oftentimes these soldiers will work for a lot less than a native colonist would. And so that has the net effect of also driving down colonial wages. And so dock workers, soldiers, they're always kind of getting into fights. And so we just have all these economic pressures and political pressures. And so Boston is kind of this bubbling cauldron of tension. And so one of the places that the Sons of Liberty liked to target was the Customs House in Boston, where they would collect these taxes. And so we know the Sons of Liberty would love to burn this place down, so it pretty much has a continuous guard of soldiers surrounding it and protecting it. So one day, the soldiers are standing outside the Customs House, and a colonist walks by and starts yelling at them, right? And then the crowd gets a little bit bigger. And then more colonists are yelling at them, and the crowd gets a little bit bigger. And then some colonists start throwing snowballs, and the crowd gets a little bit bigger. And then people start putting rocks in the snowballs and throwing them, and the crowd gets a little bit bigger. And so what you end up having is this angry mob surrounding these British soldiers, throwing stuff, screaming. It seems like it's getting violent. Stuff gets confusing. Stuff gets out of control. And somebody opens fire. And the rest of the soldiers hearing the shots, they open fire too. And 5 people will die. So this is really a case of manslaughter, not murder, right? These soldiers didn't set out to shoot anybody. They were just kind of terrified, and stuff got out of hand. And 9 British soldiers do actually go on trial in the colonies, and they're defended by John Adams, our second president. And 2 were convicted of manslaughter, the others are acquitted. So this was an accident more than anything else. But this event gets used by colonial radicals to rouse public opinion through propaganda. And so here you can see an engraving by Paul Revere. He kind of plagiarized this, but whatever, depicting this idea. So look at how the colonists are being told what happened in Boston. Look at the soldiers are in formation. You see the guy behind them, you know, ordering them to fire, and the colonists are running away. Oh my God, there's even a dog, right? When in fact this wasn't happening, right? But if you lived in, you know, rural Georgia, you probably don't know anybody that lives in Boston. And so you open the paper and you see this picture by Paul Revere and you think, oh my God, what are the British doing? And so the propaganda is beginning to create this narrative that the British are denying colonists natural rights and the British are becoming tyrannical. And so we see the propaganda that colonists' natural rights are being denied and the British are becoming tyrannical really start to form. So we'll pause here in case you need to catch up on anything. So from 1770 to 1773, we don't have any real big events that happen, but these pressures, these arguments about sovereignty and about tyranny and about natural rights, they're still bubbling. And we're going to see hundreds and hundreds of little local conflicts that are going to force more and more people to have to choose sides. And just one example of this is the Gaspee incident. The Gaspee incident takes place in Rhode Island when some colonists in Rhode Island boarded and burned an English ship to the waterline named the Gaspee. And so this in and of itself isn't that significant, but when you realize that there's probably hundreds of little incidents like this happening all across the colonies, you can see that things are kind of building. And opposition in the colonies to imperial control is going to increasingly become organized because of things like the Committees of Correspondence. The Committees of Correspondence were groups of letter writers who would coordinate opposition and stir up dissent. And so what they would do is they would almost be like chain letters. So, you know, because communication being what it was difficult for people in one colony to know what was happening in another colony. So that's what these Committees of Correspondence would do. They would, my friend in New York would write a letter to me, and I would make a copy of that letter and send it to my friend in Pennsylvania, who would make a copy of that letter and write his own letter and send it to his friend in Georgia, and on and on. And through that, they're able to organize resistance. Okay, we're all going to boycott or whatever. And so more and more, people are having to choose a side. Are you on the side of colonial sovereignty, or are you loyal to the crown? And you need to understand that not everyone was opposed to the crown. And in fact, most people were very, very reluctant to have a full-on confrontation. They are English people. They grew up being told that they were British, that they were Englishmen, that this was their country. They loved their king. They thought of the king in many respects the way we today would think of our father. So in these early stages, almost no one wants rebellion. And even when the revolution begins, it's only a minority that want it. Approximately 1/3 of the colonists are for rebellion. Approximately 1/3 of the colonists were completely against rebellion, were loyalists and stayed loyal to the crown. And about 1/3 were indifferent, right, or undecided. Now, once the revolution gets going, those numbers change. But at the beginning, it is actually just a minority that wanted to rebel. And there was great reluctance to go against the king, to go against Parliament, to go against home. So we will pause here in case you need to catch up on something. Things are going to come to a head after Parliament passes the Tea Act of 1773. So when Parliament passes the Tea Act, they actually are not even thinking of the American colonies at the time. This was actually designed to help out the British East India Company. The British East India Company primarily traffics in tea, and it's this weird kind of public-private thing in India where they're kind of the government of India, but not really, but kind of are. So anyways, by this point in history, the British East India Company is struggling to turn a profit. And so Parliament passes the Tea Act to help them out. And so there were 3 provisions to the Tea Act. The first was that it lowered the tax on tea. It lowered the tax on tea. This made tea ridiculously cheap. So it lowered the tax on tea. The second thing it did was it granted the East India Company a monopoly on selling tea in the colonies. It granted the East India Company a monopoly on selling tea in the colonies. So only the East India Company is allowed to sell tea. And finally, it appointed royal agents to sell the tea in the colonies. So the idea being that only official royal agents are going to be tea merchants now. So colonial merchants no longer get to sell tea. And this was designed to, crack down on smuggling, to make sure the taxes are being paid. But all in all, they thought the colonists would be happy. This did, after all, make tea pretty cheap. So they were kind of unhappily surprised when the colonial tea merchants and smugglers and interpreters were furious. This was widely interpreted, especially because its timing comes so close to the Townshend Acts, as yet another move to establish Parliament's authority. So again, the issue here is not about money, because this actually makes tea cheap, right? It makes tea less expensive. The issue here was sovereignty. Who is the British to tell us what tea to buy and who we can buy it from? So colonists once again begin boycotts, and within these boycotts there's lots of intimidation, especially by groups like the Sons of Liberty. But this is going to lead us down to something called the Boston Tea Party, which takes place in December of 1773. So the boycott begins, right? And colonists start to boycott tea. And of course, tea, big deal in the colonies. Everybody drinks tea. And if you're not drinking alcohol, you're drinking tea. And in December of 1773, the first East India Company ship arrives in Boston Harbor. But the people, the radicals, are refusing to allow them to offload this tea. And the reason why is that they face a dilemma. Because remember, it's not a majority of people, even in Boston, who are kind of radical. And so they know that if this tea gets off the ship, it's so cheap that the boycott is going to fail. Most people will not help themselves. They will just buy the tea. It's like for people who say, I hate Walmart, I never shop there, and then they get the Black Friday ad and they're like, except today. Today I need to go buy a TV, right? So they know that if this tea gets off the boat, the boycott is going to fail. So a radical organization in Boston, we don't know who, even to this day, but many historians speculate that it's probably the Sons of Liberty, but we have no definitive proof. A radical organization decides to solve this problem. And so they dress up as Native Americans, they storm the British ship, and they dump the tea in the harbor. So, the Boston Tea Party is significant for 2 reasons. The first is that Britain views this as evidence that the colonies, and especially Boston, are out of control. Britain views this as evidence that the colonies, and especially Boston, are out of control. And the second reason it is significant is because it leads to the Intolerable Acts. It leads to the Intolerable Acts. So we will pause here in case you need to catch up on anything. So this leads to the Intolerable Acts of 1774. Another name for these, the British name for these, are the coercive acts, right? So they're trying to coerce, to force the colonists to behave, whereas the colonists said, this is intolerable, oh my God, we're being tortured. So it depends on which side of the pond you're on as to what you call this. So Parliament was not pleased by the Tea Party, and it's going to pass 4 separate acts that are known collectively as the coercive acts. And what's very interesting about these is that they were punitive in nature, which is weird. Usually you don't pass laws to punish your localities, right? You don't pass laws to punish the state of Texas, for example. But they're doing this to punish the colonies. And especially in general Massachusetts, and most specifically Boston, in order to try to force them to behave. And based on the amount of localism most colonial troops displayed in the 7 Years' War, the British believed that the other colonies really wouldn't care what was being done to Boston. They figured most colonists wouldn't see it as an us. They would see it as a them. So, oh look, the British are punishing them in Boston. So it's going to come as a nasty surprise to them when they discover that the colonists said they're punishing us in Boston. So let's talk about the specific acts. The first is the Boston Port Act. The Boston Port Act closed the port of Boston to trade until the colonists had paid for the dumped tea. So Boston's lifeblood is commerce, is shipping. And what this is effectively going to do is kill Massachusetts' whole economy. Everybody was kind of linked by shipping. So this is a big deal. It is crippling Massachusetts' economy, and Boston's economy in particular. The second was the Administration of Justice Act. The Administration of Justice Act allowed any British soldier or official who was charged with a crime while performing his duties to be put on trial in England. It allowed any British soldier or official who was charged with a crime while performing his duties to be put on trial in England. And so this really scared the colonies because this seemed like greater evidence of growing tyranny. Why would you do that? It would be understandable if people couldn't get a fair trial in the colonies, but that wasn't true. Look at the Boston Massacre trial. Most of them get acquitted, right? Only 2 are convicted of manslaughter, and they were represented. So this seemed aimed at the heart of freedom, right? That it's basically, it was interpreted as giving kind of a green light to British officials that, you know, they wouldn't be held accountable for any actions in the colonies, which was just inviting tyranny. The next was a new quartering act that applied to all colonies and allowed the British Army to house troops wherever necessary, including private buildings. This applied to all colonies and allowed the British Army to house troops wherever necessary, including private buildings. So this is a huge deal, and this was really annoying to colonists, and this is why it's the Third Amendment to the Constitution, right? It's that important, because this meant that the Army could bang on your door and say, this is Joe, he's sleeping in your bed, make sure that he's fed. And what if Joe was a horrible human being? And by the way, you don't want Joe there anyway. So this is a big, big, big deal. And so this also seemed to be violating that natural right of property. And so once again, this evidence of tyranny, right? That the government is becoming tyrannical, it's trampling on people's natural rights. And finally, the Massachusetts Government Act, which terminated most of the self-government in the colony of Massachusetts. It terminated most self-government in the colony of Massachusetts. One way it did this was by now stating that members of the governor's council and sheriffs would be appointed rather than elected. Members of the governor's council and sheriffs would now be appointed rather than elected. And so during this time period, the colonies all had a governor who was appointed by the crown. But the governor was just one person. So in order to run the colony, he had to rely on local officials, his council, the sheriffs. And so kind of the check on authority was that those people were elected by the colonists. So they could make sure that, colonial rights were being protected. But now the sheriff is going to be appointed. And of course the governor is not going to pick somebody who's going to tell him, no, we don't do that here. He's going to pick somebody who does what he's told. And so once again, this looks like growing tyranny, taking away colonials' rights to liberty and sovereignty and concentrating it in the hands of this imperial government. The second thing the Massachusetts Government Act did was it limited the number of town meetings, and all town meetings would need the governor's prior approval. So once again, taking away local control. Things are further going to seem tyrannical because a new governor of Massachusetts was also appointed at this time. And the new governor is a guy named General Thomas Gage. Okay, well, why would you put a general in charge of the colony unless you were doing it because you were becoming even more tyrannical? Why are you putting the military in charge of the civilian place? Many colonists saw this as evidence of growing tyranny. Finally, the last thing that's passed, which is not part of the coercive acts, but was passed around the same time, so in colonists' minds it tended to be lumped in with these, even though it's not technically a coercive act, is something called the Quebec Act. Now, the Quebec Act technically applied to Canada, and it did two things. The first thing it did was it guaranteed French Canadians the right to practice Catholicism. And guaranteed French Canadians the right to practice Catholicism. So keep in mind that there was this kind of bloody history in England between Protestants, particularly Puritan Protestants, and Catholics. And there is a lot of, even to this day, anti-Catholic prejudice in Great Britain. So the fact that most of these British people in the colonies are going to be Protestant, are going to be many of them Puritan, and are going to be able to see French Canadians being Catholic is going to upset them. And the second thing the Quebec Act did was it declared the lands in the Proclamation of 1763 east of the Appalachian Mountains that this land would now be governed from Quebec. So the lands in the Proclamation of 1763 east of the Appalachian Mountains would now be governed from Quebec. So what this means then is this land would technically then be Canadian, right? It would not become part of the existing colonies. So Virginia isn't getting any more land for Virginia. So this is going to anger colonists. Remember, they're landless. This was the whole reason they fought in that war. And now you gave it to Canada? Are you kidding me? So this too is going to be very, very angering. So we will pause here in case you need to catch up on something. The British plan with the Intolerable Acts was to punish Massachusetts, and they figured no one would care. But in fact, the Intolerable Acts will serve to unify the colonies. And so much to Britain's surprise, the other colonies are going to rally behind Boston. And we will begin to see them boycotting once again. We're going to see secret meetings increase. And eventually a call goes out for a Continental Congress to form. And so this leads to the first Continental Congress in 1774. So if we're calling something the first Continental Congress, that clues you in that there will be a sequel, right? You don't call something the first until there's a second. So the first Continental Congress meets in Philadelphia in 1774. And remember, this is illegal. You are not supposed to be meeting and figuring out ways to thwart the king and Parliament. So what these guys are doing is illegal. And at the Continental Congress, they agreed, as usual, to a boycott. So once again, they'll start boycotting British goods. But here they amp it up a notch. And so in addition to a boycott, they also agreed to a non-export agreement. So not only are they not going to buy, which is what a boycott is, they're not going to sell either. They're not going to export anything to British either. They also sent an address to the king and to the British and colonial people listing their grievances. Now, the fact that they're sending this address to their king is significant instead of to Parliament, because what this does is it shows us that at this point, the colonists are not considering Parliament to be a legitimate legislature over the colonies. They are addressing the king, so they're recognizing the king as legitimate, but not as Parliament. And basically in this address, they're begging George III to protect them from this growing tyranny. And finally, they created continental associations to make sure that the boycott was enforced. And of course, the way that a lot of these associations are going to be enforcing the boycott is using some pretty shady methods, right? A lot of intimidation, be a shame if something were to happen to your tea shop here type of thing. In any event, the First Continental Congress prefaces its actions with a Declaration of Rights that assured the natural rights of the colonists. So here we see the ideas of John Locke, and they're talking about, these natural rights of life, liberty, and property that they want the king to protect. It's also important to note that hardly anyone, not even Sam Adams, Mr. Sons of Liberty himself, is calling for independence at this point. They're not there yet, but they will get there very quickly. So we will pause here in case you need to catch up on something. After the First Continental Congress, this is going to lead us to the shot heard round the world, Lexington and Concord. So here's what happened. Back in Boston, while this is going on, colonists in Massachusetts are really upset. Remember, the Intolerable Acts are aimed at Massachusetts and Boston. And so colonists in Massachusetts are going to respond to the Massachusetts Government Act by forming provincial congresses. And these provincial congresses are going to become the colony's de facto government. So basically you now have two competing governments. You have Thomas Gage in Boston, who's making one set of rules, and then you have the provincial Congress, which is making other rules, and they're each claiming to be legitimate, they're each collecting taxes, they're each arming. So one thing that the provincial government does is create something called the Committee of Safety, which was headed by John Hancock. And the Committee of Safety was responsible for organizing a militia. And it called for an armed force of, quote, Minutemen, who could be ready at a moment's notice. And the Committee of Public Safety begins to stockpile weapons and stockpile guns. And other colonies are going to begin to following their lead and do the same as the news travels over these committees of correspondence. So Britain has to respond to these preparations, and things are getting tense with these two governments of all. And we see just how tense things are with something called the powder alarm. What happens is in 1774, in September of 1774, there is this false rumor that the royal governor, General Thomas Gage, had opened fire on the people of Boston. So this didn't actually happen. It was just this rumor that it had happened. And this is called the powder alarm because it led to over 3,000 colonists from Massachusetts grabbing their guns and converging on Boston before they found out that this was untrue. And so in and of itself, I mean, they found out it's not true, they went home. In and of itself, not that significant. But it did have long-range significance because first, Gage realizes that he is outnumbered and that the colonists are at the verge of violence. He knows that he doesn't have enough British troops to, keep Boston or keep Massachusetts if things really came to a head, and that things might come to a head, that the colonists are really, really upset. And so the second thing he does is he begins to construct fortifications in Boston. He begins to fortify it, which, to be fair, in his place he probably should have done, right? And he also looks to try to curb some of this colonial militancy. Also, to be fair, something he should have done. But from the colonial perspective, this looks like, once again, growing tyranny. Why are you going to start to crack down on people? Why are you fortifying Boston if you don't plan some kind of tyrannical thing. So things are coming to a head. So this leads us to April 14th, 1775. On April 14th, 1775, Gage issues orders to arrest Sam Adams and John Hancock and to destroy munitions that are being stockpiled. So he wants the army to go arrest Sam Adams, who's the head of the Sons of Liberty, and John Hancock, who's the head of the Committee of Safety, and to destroy some of these weapons that are being stockpiled. And this is all in the effort to crack down on that colonial militancy. And so to do this, he assembled 700 men on the Boston Commons, and they begin to march toward the towns of Lexington and Concord, where they think Adams and Hancock are. So this is that famous Paul Revere's Ride, right? This is where Paul Revere comes in, and you only know this because there was a poem written about it, right? One if by land, two if by sea, the British are coming, the British are coming. So it makes it sound like in that poem, like Paul Revere is some kind of like secret agent ninja, right, who spies the British and, you know, rides on. And there were several riders, not just Paul Revere. And it is because of that, you know, Hancock and Adams get away. But, I mean, this was 700 men wearing bright red coats in the middle of downtown who marched in a straight line behind drums, right? It's not like this was a secret. So this was very, very visible. Anyways, thanks to these forward riders, Adams and Hancock, who were in Lexington, escaped. And when the soldiers reached Lexington at dawn, they find around 70 armed militiamen in formation on the village green. Now, it's unlikely that these militiamen wanted to fight, right? The odds are not good, 70 to 700. Most likely, they just probably wanted to show some defiance. But these militiamen are ordered to retreat, and they don't, and things get tense, and all of a sudden, shots ring out. Now, to this day, we don't know who fired first. Whether it was the British or the Lexington militia. My money is on the militia, right? The British were trained soldiers, they had drilled. In theory, they wouldn't have done this, whereas the colonists were just kind of guys with a gun. So probably the colonists weren't as disciplined as the British, but we don't know for sure. Regardless of who opened fire first, the British responded with a volley. It hits 18, and that kind of ends Lexington. From there, the British move on and they start marching towards Concord. When they get to Concord, what had happened in Lexington had already reached the Americans there. And the British then start to destroy the supplies and munitions that the Americans had gathered there. But if you look at Concord, if you look at the map where it is, to get there, the British actually had to cross over this bridge. And so the Americans, while the British are doing this, the Americans are actually going to attack them from their rear. And the British are going to panic, and they're going to begin to retreat towards Boston. And while the British are retreating towards Boston, it's very disorganized, it's very pell-mell. And while they flee, the Minutemen and the militia are going to be shooting at them from both sides of the road. And this is going to be a rout for the British because by the time all is said and done, over 273 British soldiers out of 700 were either dead, wounded, or missing. And so news of this shot heard around the world, is going to spread around the colonies via rider very quickly. And it rallied the people, it galvanized the people of the colonies. And the significance of Lexington and Concord, aside from being the opening shots of the American Revolution, is that after this, calls are going to go out for a second Continental Congress. So we will pause here in case you need to catch up on something. So this leads us to the Second Continental Congress, the sequel, which starts on May 10, 1775 in Philadelphia and will continue throughout the American Revolution. So the British had ignored the complaints from the first Continental Congress. So in Philadelphia, they begin to debate about what to do. And at the Second Continental Congress, it's not let's go into independence. There's actually different factions. There is a peace faction that very much wanted to figure out a peaceful solution and work out some kind of agreement with the crown. And by far, that's probably the majority there. And then there was a more radical faction that was in favor of independence. And so the peace faction is initially going to win out when they send out something called the Olive Branch Petition. The Olive Branch Petition was basically their way to try to smooth things over, to try to, restore peace. Meanwhile, while all this is going on, there are actual battles taking place, even though independence has not yet been declared. And the most significant of these is going to be the Battle of Bunker Hill. Now, this actually takes place on the next hill over, which is Breed's Hill, so it's kind of misnamed, but alas, it's called the Battle of Bunker Hill, even though that's not where it was. So this is all about cannons. Breed's Hill was overlooking Boston Harbor, and the British had a cannon up there. And this hill was really important because whoever controls this cannon can basically shoot ships out of the water. So whoever controls this cannon controls Boston Harbor. And so the colonists went and took this cannon from the British, and the British won it back. And so on June 17, 1775, the British Army crossed the Charles River that overlooked Boston in order to try to capture it. And so this is that famous phrase, don't fire till you see the whites of their eyes. They're doing that, they're saying that the idea was because of, the ammunition, but it was actually because the weapons were so incredibly inaccurate that you wanted to make sure that they were close so that you would hit them. In any event, the Americans do lose this battle, but they inflict very, very heavy casualties. And so Bunker Hill is really, really significant. First, after Bunker Hill, many colonists are now going to join into opposition against Britain. There were a lot of Americans that were on the fence, but when it became clear that the British were willing to use an army to attack colonists, for many that was a step too far. And so this is going to galvanize a lot of Americans to switch sides and to side with the colonists. The second reason this is significant is because it convinced the British that the colonists were rebelling. It convinced the British that the colonists were rebelling. So that takes it up a notch. Before it was just Massachusetts who was misbehaving, and now it's all the colonies that are rebelling. So that's a big deal. And so it leads to something called the American Prohibitory Act. The American Prohibitory Act declared the colonies to be in, quote, open rebellion. It declared the colonies to be in, quote, open rebellion. So this isn't Massachusetts is misbehaving, and this isn't even Massachusetts is rebelling. This is the colonies is in open rebellion. And so it first forbade commerce with the colonies. It forbade commerce with the colonies. So the people in the British Empire are not allowed to trade with the colonies. Second, it began a blockade of colonial ports. It began a blockade of colonial ports. Third, colonial ships were now subject to seizure. Colonial ships were now subject to seizure. And fourth, leaders of this rebellion, if captured, would be tried and executed as traitors. Leaders, if captured, would now be tried and executed as traitors. And so who are the leaders? Every single person at that Second Continental Congress, right? And so if you were convicted of treason during this time period, it's not just a death sentence for you, a death sentence which will probably involve torture, but it also means all of your property is forfeit to the crown. So not only are you going to die, but your family is going to be left penniless and outcast. Nobody's going to want anything to do with the family of a traitor. So this will not just end your life, but it will ruin your family's life for generations as well. So the stakes just got really, really high. So these moves will basically end the Continental Congress's willingness to look for a peaceful resolution. The Continental Congress knows at this point there is no going back. And so the Second Continental Congress will eventually become, in effect, a national government during the Revolution. And as a national government, they will begin to impose taxes, and they will begin to make laws in support of the rebellion. And one of the laws that they do is they authorize the creation of a Continental Army under the command of George Washington in order to fight the British. So we will stop here in case you need to catch up on something. And so after much debate, they will finally adopt the Declaration of Independence on July 4th, 1776. And this is a date you must memorize, that the Declaration of Independence is on July 4th, 1776. And so the Declaration has two parts. There is a preamble justifying the revolution on the basis of natural rights, and it's very much using the language of republicanism. And it provides a list of grievances against the George III, classifying him as a tyrant and justifying the revolution. And then the second part is all, this list of grievances. And so I'm going to play you a clip from the HBO miniseries John Adams, which is, by the way, phenomenal and historically accurate if you're interested in this time period in history. But this clip opens up with John Adams standing up and giving his speech before the Second Continental Congress, urging them to declare independence. And he's trying to convince these people who, you see him standing up and talking after somebody had just sat down, who basically warned them that, the British Army is the best in the world, the Navy is the best in the world, we're going to be crushed like itty bitty bugs, it's going to be horrible, let's not do this. And so you see John Adams stand up and give a speech basically saying, we need to do this and here's why. And then it goes to them reading the parts of the Declaration of Independence. So as you watch this, listen carefully for language about the social contract, about natural rights, about those fears of republicanism, about the virtue and tyranny and grievances, and jot them down and make note of them. And then you can talk about it in your group after we stop.
President recognizes Mr. Adams of Massachusetts.
Objects of the most stupendous magnitude. Measures which will affect the lives of millions, born and unborn, are now before us. We must expect a great expense of blood to obtain. But we must always remember that a free constitution of civil government cannot be purchased at too dear a rate, as there is nothing on this side of Jerusalem of greater importance to mankind. My worthy colleague from Pennsylvania spoken with great ingenuity and eloquence. He has given you a grim prognostication of our national future, but where he foresees apocalypse, I see hope. I see a new nation ready to take its place in the world. Not an empire, but a republic. And a republic of laws, not men. Gentlemen, we are in the very midst of revolution, the most complete, unexpected, and remarkable of any in the history of the world. How few of the human race have ever had an opportunity of choosing a system of government for themselves and their children. I am not without apprehensions, gentlemen. But the end we have in sight is more than worth all the means. I believe, sirs, that the hour has come. My judgment approves this measure, and my whole heart is in it. All that I have, all that I am, and all that I hope in this life, I am now ready to stake upon it. While I live, let me have a country. A free country.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, and that all men are created equal, and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is in the right of the people to alter or abolish it, and to institute new governments. The history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries, all having a direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states.
Every stage of its oppressions we have petitioned for redress in the most humble terms. Our repeated petitions have been answered only by repeated injury. A prince, whose character is thus marked by every act which may define a tyrant, is unfit to be the ruler of a free people.
We, therefore, the representatives of the United States of America, solemnly publish and declare that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown.
And for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor.
God save our American states! God save our American states!
Okay, so we will pause here. In your groups, make sure everyone can identify some of that language about the social contract, about natural rights, about republicanism, about tyranny. So what follows is the American Revolution. And so the background here is that the main British general is a guy named General Charles Cornwallis. And America's main army, or main ally in the war, is France, who by 1780 had generously lent us some of their navy, which was nice because we didn't have one of our own. And so George Washington's strategy throughout the war is effectively to outrun and outlast the British Army, because he knows that in most instances they can't take the army on head-on. So he fights when the conditions favor fighting, and he runs and makes the British chase him when it doesn't. All the idea of wearing down the British. Their supply lines are kind of a nightmare in this war. And so it was a very effective strategy. And there were three main theaters of war in the American Revolution. The first fighting takes place in New England, where eventually the British are going to lose everywhere except New York. New York they conquer, everywhere else they lose. Then it moves down into kind of the mid-Atlantic. They ultimately lose there, and then the final theater of war is going to be in the South. And so things will come to a head at Yorktown. Yorktown is kind of the final battle here. And in 1781, Cornwallis took his army into Virginia in order to wait for reinforcements and resupply on the tip of the Chesapeake Peninsula in Yorktown. And you can see on the map where it is. So he's waiting to be resupplied by sea. Remember, their supply lines are kind of a mess. Well, it turns out that France's navy had defeated the British Navy in the Chesapeake Bay, and you can see there where the naval battles were, which means resupply was not coming. Meanwhile, while the British Navy has been defeated, Cornwallis is kind of trapped on the peninsula. He's got water at his back, and in comes the American army, one led by Washington, one led by Lafayette. And so Cornwallis has nowhere to go. And so he will surrender on October 18th, 1781. And once Cornwallis surrenders, this effectively ends the fighting. Now, after Cornwallis surrenders, we actually kind of dodge a bullet, and this is called the Newburgh Conspiracy. Because after the surrender, there are some members of the American military who actually proposed a military coup. This idea of taking over, becoming in charge, and actually George Washington got wind of this. And George Washington went into where these officers are meeting, and he said, listen, anyone who would do this was no friend of mine, was no friend of the country, goes against everything we fought of. And that was enough to quash this, and again demonstrated Washington's virtue. Without Washington, maybe the Newburgh Conspiracy does go on. Maybe the United States becomes very different from what it becomes. But thanks to Washington and Washington's virtue, we avoid this. So we will pause here in case you need to catch up on something. So after Cornwallis surrenders at Yorktown, that effectively ends the fighting. But the only thing that can officially end the war is a peace treaty. And so the peace treaty that ends the American Revolution is called the Treaty of Paris, 1783. So the Treaty of Paris is negotiated by four guys, Ben Franklin, John Jay, John Adams, and Henry Lawrence. And they are going to negotiate with the British and the French separately. So they end up playing each power off against the other. So sometimes the Treaty of Paris is called the greatest triumph in the history of American diplomacy, because we get way more in this treaty than anybody, really thought we could have. And so this treaty had 5 major parts. First, it granted America independence. First, it granted America independence. Second, it established the border at the Mississippi River and the Great Lakes. It established the border at the Mississippi River and the Great Lakes. Third, it granted freedom to all parties to use the Mississippi River. It granted freedom to all parties to use the Mississippi River. It granted freedom to all parties to use the Mississippi River. Fourth, the Spanish gained control of Florida, or maintained control of Florida. The Spanish will maintain control of Florida. And fifth, the one concession to Britain was that debts to British merchants still remain valid. Debts to British merchants still remain valid. So you can't say, if you owed a bill to, a tea merchant or a tea factory in England, you can't say, we fought a revolution, I'm not going to pay you. So we will stop there in case you need to catch up on something. So in this lecture, you should now be able to tell me about the ideas and the thinkers of the Enlightenment, particularly the ones that had an influence on the ideology and the rhetoric of the American Revolution. You should be able to identify and explain the significance of the ideology of republicanism and virtue, as well as their impact on the rhetoric in the American Revolution. Next, you should be able to explain Britain's main reasons for attempting to overturn salutary neglect, and then explain how the colonists responded to the new acts and trace the evolutionary process that brought the colonies closer to rebellion. Then you'll trace the path of the revolution from the Townshend Acts of 1767 to the meeting of the First Continental Congress. And finally, you'll explain how the American Revolution began, describe the first battles of the conflict, how it ended, and the Treaty of Paris.